It was 1976, Indianapolis's Market Square Arena, and the crowd was electric. Elvis had just stepped off stage when he froze. By the loading bay, an elderly janitor in a faded cap leaned on his mop, head bowed. The king walked toward him. No cameras, no spotlight. No one knew this moment would change a life. If you love real stories of music legends showing their heart off stage, stick around. This one proves why Elvis wasn't just the king on stage, but in life too. Applause was still shaking the concrete walls when Elvis stepped off stage and stopped dead in his tracks. It was June 1976, Market Square Arena, Indianapolis. The heat backstage was thick, stage lights still burning through the open curtain, and the smell of sweat and cigarette smoke drifting in from the loading dock. His white jumpsuit shimmered under the buzzing fluorescence, rhinestones catching the light as he pulled the mic from his collar and handed it to a stagehand. The crew moved with the usual post-show urgency, coiling cables, snapping shut heavy black cases, shouting over the ringing in their ears. One roadie lugged an amp past. Another pushed a rack of guitars toward the truck bay. The air was loud with the clank of metal on metal, the squeak of dolly wheels, the slam of case latches. But at the far end of the hall, by the big freight door, everything seemed slower. An elderly man in a faded blue uniform was mopping the concrete in slow, steady arcs. His back was bent, the mop handle polished smooth by years of use. A green janitor's cap sat low on his forehead, shadowing his face. Elvis slowed his stride. Something about the man's hands caught his eye. The slight tremor, the way he gripped the handle like it was the only thing keeping him upright. A young lighting tech noticed Elvis looking. "That's Walter," he murmured. "Been here every show. Never says much." Walter's mop sloshed through a shallow puddle of spilled water, the ripples reflecting the harsh overhead lights. He didn't glance up, didn't break rhythm. Elvis's entourage, 2 security men, his road manager, a couple of friends, were already halfway toward the dressing room. "Come on," someone called, but Elvis didn't move. He could still hear the echo of the crowd upstairs, the muffled chant of his name. But here, in this back corridor, it was just the swish of the mop and the hum of the vending machine. He took a step toward Walter. There was something in the man's posture, a quiet weight, that pulled at Elvis. He had seen thousands of faces on tour, from screaming fans to tired roadies, but this felt different. Walter shifted his bucket aside, leaned the mop against the wall, and started wringing out the heavy gray strands with hands that shook more than before. Elvis's gaze didn't leave him. A member of the crew muttered, "You'll be late for the meet and greet." Elvis didn't answer. He adjusted his belt, squared his shoulders, and started walking, not toward the dressing room, but straight toward the janitor. The hallway chatter quieted as they watched the king close the distance, each step slow and deliberate. No one knew what he was about to say or why. Elvis stopped just a few feet from the man, close enough to hear the quiet squeak of wet shoes on concrete. "Even Sir," Elvis said, his voice low but warm. Walter didn't look up right away. He dipped the mop into the bucket, wrung it out again, and only then muttered, "Just doing my job." His tone wasn't cold, just tired, as if each word cost him effort. Elvis crouched slightly, bringing himself to the old man's eye level. "I'm Elvis," he said with a small smile, though they both knew there was no need for introductions. Walter finally lifted his gaze. Under the brim of his cap were pale blue eyes framed by deep lines. They studied Elvis for a moment, before he nodded once, polite but reserved. Around them, the backstage chaos continued. A dolly rattled past carrying folded stage risers. Somewhere down the hall, a laugh broke out. The smell of strong coffee from the break room mixed with the tang of cleaning chemicals rising from Walter's bucket. "You work here long?" Elvis asked. Walter nodded. 30 years, give or take. Seen a lot of shows. From back here, he gestured toward the floor, not the stage. "You ever go out front?" Elvis asked. Walter chuckled dryly. "Nah. My job's making sure the place looks good when you folks are gone." Elvis tilted his head. You play? Walter hesitated, eyes dropping to the mop handle. Used to. Guitar. Long time ago. That's for younger men now. Something flickered across Elvis's face. Not pity, but recognition. You still got one? Walter shook his head. Pawned it after my boy was born. Never bought another. The king glanced toward the dressing room, then back at Walter. Stick around a minute, he said quietly, as if sharing a secret. Walter frowned. For what? You'll see. Elvis straightened, scanned the hallway, and caught his manager's eye. Without a word, he beckoned him over and leaned close. The whisper was too low for anyone else to hear, but whatever he said made the manager's eyebrows lift in surprise. The manager gave a short nod and disappeared toward the dressing room. Elvis stayed where he was, leaning casually against the wall like he had all the time in the world. Walter resumed wringing the mop, slower now, glancing up every so often. The crew's movement in the background seemed to quiet, curiosity building. 2 minutes passed, then 5. Finally, footsteps echoed from the far end of the hall, the manager returning, carrying something long and rectangular in one hand. Walter squinted at the shape. Elvis smiled. Told you to stick around. The manager's footsteps grew louder, the sound of hard soles on concrete, echoing in the narrow hall. In his hand was a battered brown guitar case, edges scuffed from years of travel. The brass latches caught the overhead light. Walter froze, his hands still gripping the mop handle. Elvis stepped forward and took the case from his manager. Haven't seen this one out in a while, he said, his tone casual but his eyes stayed locked on Walter. The noise backstage had shifted from the clang of gear to a quiet hum of curiosity. Crew members leaned against walls, a couple peering from the open doorway of the break room. Even the sound of the vending machine seemed muted, as if the room itself was waiting. Elvis set the case on a road case nearby and popped the first latch. Click, then the second. Click, the lid creaked open. Inside, the Gibson's polished wood glowed in the fluorescent light. Deep cherry sunburst, chrome tuning keys gleaming, fresh strings stretched tight. It looked like it belonged on a stage, not in a hallway. Walter's breath caught. His eyes followed the curve of the guitar's body, the way the light ran across the lacquer. Elvis nodded toward it. Go on. Walter didn't move. I couldn't, he said quietly, shaking his head. Yes, you can, Elvis replied, voice soft but certain. With slow hands, Walter lifted the guitar from its velvet cradle. His fingers hovered above the strings, trembling, not from weakness, but from the weight of the moment. I haven't touched one in 30 years, Walter whispered. Elvis tilted his head. Then you're overdue. Walter shifted his grip, thumb running over the worn neck. He set his left hand on the fretboard, pressed gently, and with his right hand strummed once. The chord rang clear, warm and bright against the cold concrete wall. A couple of crew members glanced at each other. The sound had a strange gravity, drawing everyone closer without words. Walter adjusted the tuning peg instinctively, his ear catching a slight sharpness on the high E string. It was the kind of reflex you don't lose, no matter how many years pass. Elvis smiled faintly. What happened next left the entire crew standing still. Walter tested another chord, his hands beginning to find their old rhythm. Elvis stepped back a few feet, giving him space, and hooked his thumbs in his belt. You ready? Elvis asked. Walter looked up, puzzled. For what? For me to sing along. Before Walter could answer, Elvis turned to the crew. Clear a little room here. The hallway shifted, people stepping aside, eyes fixed on the old man with the Gibson, and the king standing beside him. The first note came hesitant, almost shy, a single bend on the third string that lingered in the stale hallway air. Walter's fingers moved slowly at first, feeling for familiar territory on the fretboard. The tone was rich but unpolished, like a voice warming up after decades of silence. Elvis stood beside him, watching his hands, his own head nodding softly to the beat. Then Elvis joined in, not with the swagger of the stage, but with a low, easy baritone that rolled through the corridor. No microphone, no spotlight, just the man and his voice. The hallway smelled faintly of black coffee from the break room, and the faint hiss of an amp somewhere down the hall, mixed with the clean ring of the Gibson. A nearby exit door let in a faint breeze, carrying the muffled hum of the city outside. Crew members stopped what they were doing. A sound engineer leaned on a flight case. A couple of stagehands exchanged quiet grins. The rhythm of work had dissolved, replaced by something rare. Walter's left hand steadied, sliding into a simple blues progression. His right hand, calloused from decades of mopping floors rather than plucking strings, began to find its old accuracy. His foot tapped softly on the concrete. Elvis smiled. "That's it," he murmured between lines. By the second verse, Walter wasn't just playing. He was playing well, the kind of skill you don't expect from someone who'd claimed he'd given it up. His hands moved with quiet confidence, filling the space between Elvis's phrases. Someone in the crew pulled out a small cassette recorder, pressing the red button with a soft click. The reels began to spin. Walter closed his eyes. The hallway vanished for him. The mop, the bucket, the empty arena above. He was on a porch in summer, his younger self's guitar in his lap, playing for no one but the joy of it. Elvis leaned in, harmonizing softly on the chord. Their voices, so different in texture, found a warm middle ground that made the crew shift their weight and glance at each other, as if to say, "Are we really hearing this?" Walter hit a run of clean, bright notes and let them hang. Elvis looked down the hall. "Get me a scarf," he said suddenly to a nearby stagehand. The man blinked, then jogged toward a black trunk by the dressing room. Walter slowed the progression, letting the song drift toward a natural end. Elvis didn't take his eyes off him. The stagehand returned, white scarf in hand. Elvis took it, looped it loosely around his palm, and turned back toward Walter with a grin that said something's coming. Elvis stepped forward, the white scarf trailing from his hand like a ribbon in the pale fluorescent light. The song's last chord was still fading when he looped the scarf around Walter's shoulders. The fabric was soft, cool from the air conditioning, and stark against the janitor's faded blue uniform. "For the best show I've seen all night," Elvis said, his voice carrying down the hallway. A ripple of laughter rolled through the crew, warm, not mocking. Walter glanced around, bewildered, his fingers still curled around the Gibson's neck. "You're kidding," he muttered. "Not a bit," Elvis replied. Somewhere a stage door slammed shut, the sound echoing in the concrete corridors. The smell of fresh coffee sharpened as someone walked by with a styrofoam cup. In the distance, a faint hum of the city mixed with the hollow quiet of an emptying arena. Walter adjusted the scarf, his rough hands brushing over the embroidery along its edge. The weight of it wasn't physical, it was the meaning. This was the kind of scarf Elvis threw to screaming fans in the front row. Elvis stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Walter could hear. "If you ever want to play again, you call my people. You'll have a seat in the front row. No ticket, no line." Walter blinked hard. "Why would you do that?" Elvis shrugged lightly. "Because the world needs to hear you." Walter didn't answer. His gaze drifted to the guitar in his hands. The weight, the feel, the way it seemed to fit against him like it used to. Elvis clapped him gently on the shoulder. "Keep it for now," he said. "Just promise me you'll play it." Walter's mouth opened in protest, but Elvis cut him off with a grin. "Don't worry, it'll get back to me one way or another." The moment hung in the air. Crew members lingered, watching silently, as if afraid to break whatever spell had settled over the hallway. A voice called from further down the corridor, something about the limo being ready. Elvis didn't move right away. He gave Walter one last look, a nod that said more than words could. Then he turned, walking toward the loading bay, security falling in step behind him. The white scarf still rested on Walter's shoulders, the Gibson cradled in his arms. Walter watched until Elvis disappeared into the night. The sound of the limo door shutting echoed faintly, followed by the low rumble of an engine pulling away. He looked down at the guitar again, running his thumb along the strings. Somewhere deep inside, something long dormant had stirred. But the real surprise came days later, after Elvis had left town. 3 days later, Walter was sitting at his kitchen table when someone knocked at the door. It was a gray Indiana morning, the kind where the sky hangs low and the streets are damp from overnight rain. Walter's coffee sat untouched beside yesterday's paper. He'd been staring out the window, lost in the memory of that hallway, the weight of the scarf, the feel of the Gibson's neck under his fingers. The knock came again, sharper this time. Walter rose slowly, joints stiff, and shuffled to the door. A courier stood there, holding a long cardboard box and a clipboard. "Walter Miller," "That's me," Walter said. "Sign here." Walter scrawled his name, the pen wobbling slightly in his hand. The courier tipped his cap and walked away without explanation. The box was light but awkward, the cardboard cool against his palms. He carried it to the kitchen, set it on the table, and sliced through the tape with a butter knife. The cardboard gave way with a faint rip, releasing the smell of fresh lacquer and packing paper. Inside was a guitar case. Walter froze, staring at it. He knew that case, every scuff and scratch. It was the same Gibson from Backstage. He flicked the latches open. Inside, the guitar gleamed as if it had been polished just for him. But now, across the body in bold silver marker, was a message. To Walter, "Keep playing, Elvis." Walter's hands shook as he traced the letters. His breath caught, eyes welling. Beneath the neck of the guitar was a sealed envelope. He slid it out, and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was neat, each word deliberate. "Walter, you'll always have a seat in the front row. Don't let the music stop." It wasn't long, but it didn't need to be. Walter set the letter down and picked up the guitar. He sat back at the kitchen table, fingers finding a familiar G chord. The sound filled the small room, warm, alive, pulling him back through the years. Neighbors later said they heard him that morning, strumming softly with the window cracked open. The following Sunday, Walter walked to the small park, a few blocks from his apartment. The air smelled of fresh cut grass. Kids chased each other near the playground, and older couples fed breadcrumbs to pigeons. Walter sat on a worn wooden bench with the Gibson in his lap. At first he just tuned it, letting the notes but soon, his hands began to play. Old blues runs, folk songs, bits of melodies he hadn't touched in decades. People stopped to listen. A young boy sat cross-legged at his feet. An older man leaned on a cane nearby, nodding along. From that day on, Walter played in the park, almost every Sunday. Sometimes it was for a handful of strangers, sometimes for no one at all. But the music was back, and so was the part of himself he thought he'd lost for good. Years later, in his small living room, the Gibson would hang on the wall above his couch. The strings stayed polished, the silver ink of Elvis's signature still bright. On quiet nights, Walter would sit beneath it with a cup of tea, thinking about the night that changed his life. It wasn't the scarf, it wasn't even the guitar. It was the fact that a man who had the world's attention took time to see him. Kindness doesn't need a stage or a crowd. Sometimes it's just a hallway, a conversation, and a moment that says, "You." If this moved you, share it with someone who believes small acts of kindness can change a life. And tell me in the comments, what's one small kindness someone showed you that you'll never forget?